Okay, so on Monday of this week, some footage came out of some Baltimore youth hopping a fence to one of our local pools that was closed and chained up at the time for them to take a swim in order to cool off from the heat. The footage of the kids swimming in the water was captured by Foxtrot, which is a police helicopter that flies around surveilling city neighborhoods. This footage was then circulated by WBAL News Radio 1090 around Twitter and YouTube and other places on social media, along with the video commentary that describes these children as breaking into one of 3 Baltimore City pools that remain closed with their gates chained. They said that the footage details the children breaking in and setting up camp and entering the water along with the scooter. Now, even this coded language of their description of the event is problematic to me, because it basically paints our children as criminals instead of regular kids just looking to cool off in some water on one of the hottest days of the year so far. They describe the kids as being cramped in quotations, which in actuality, all they did was hop a fence to go swim in a pool. They mentioned the scooter as if it was one of the motorized scooters that the city has available to rent all over its most affluent areas, but it wasn't one of those scooters. It was just a simple metal scooter that you ride up and down the street. There was nothing criminal or sinister about these kids' behavior, other than the fact that they hopped the fence to jump into the water. They seemed pretty well behaved at the time. They laid their towels out next to the pool to sunbathe. The ones that couldn't swim made sure that they stayed in the shallow side of the water. Other than hopping the fence, they were all as well behaved as any kids at the pool could be. And even though it's illegal to trespass, our kids shouldn't have to break into pools in order to have access to them, especially when it's that hot outside. Access to pools, playgrounds, libraries, and all other forms of recreation should be a right. Remember, should be a right, not a privilege. Some people on Twitter, reading isn't fundamental for it, because after I made that statement yesterday, you had 1 million people attacking me saying that pools and other forms of recreation are not a right. I know that. I'm saying that they should be. Our kids shouldn't have to fight for access to things that are actually valuable parts of their own development. For our kids who are in the inner city, who are always an afterthought to the policymakers and the privileged elites who actually run the city, these are luxuries that they are shown time and time again are not a priority for them to have access to. And if you can't afford to pay to play, you're often treated as if you don't exist here. Now, the pool that the kids were swimming in clearly had algae in the water. I've swam in pools like this during my childhood against the advice of my elders and peers that cautioned against it, and I've never gotten sick or felt negatively affected by it, but I know that some people do. So I'm willing to concede the fact that there's a possibility of these kids possibly getting sick from exposing themselves to these pool conditions. And it's also possible that there were other issues with the water that could have made the kids sick if they swallowed any or were exposed for for a little too long. But I doubt any of the people that swarm to their online spaces to judge and condemn them publicly actually gave a damn if they were healthy or safe. None of you actually care about their well-being. You care about the fact that talking about them not supposedly having access to that water shows that you're right to win the argument, but it doesn't necessarily say that you prioritize their health, safety, or wellness. Now, as usual, when I spoke out about this publicly, sorry about that. Now, as usual, when I spoke out publicly about the coverage of this incident, all the racist regulars came out of hiding to once again attack and dismiss my claim that our kids should have access to these resources. First came the excuses. We don't have enough lifeguards. There isn't enough money. It's the Democrats' fault. Reckin Parks messed it up. The mayor did it. Every excuse in the book without actually acknowledging that our kids deserve access to pools and they shouldn't have to go through such lengths to be able to swim. They talked about property's liability and potential accidents. A lot of people talked about the algae in the water like it was acid. They talked about the bad parents who allowed the kids to go out of the house in the first place. They labeled those kids as dummies and idiots for getting into the water. How dirty it was. They joked about the fact that these kids had access to swimming filth, so they swam in it. They zoned in on the illegal activity without acknowledging that despite the fact that they broke a law, nobody was harmed, and the only reason why we even criminalize such acts in the first place isn't actually to keep people safe, but it's because we see these youth as being undeserving of certain resources, and nobody actually wants to be held accountable or responsible if somebody ends up getting hurt. Now, you even had some people that were bold enough to admit that they themselves did this same type of illegal activity when they were kids. And even if it was primarily at city reservoirs instead of city pools, there just weren't helicopters scrambled overhead when they did it to surveil and criminalize them for it in the same way. I wonder why that is. Do you? I think we all know why it is. Because at the end of the day, I'm always stricken by the irony of how it's predominantly the generation of baby boomer latchkey kids who were themselves allowed to roam free throughout the city and the counties as kids and teenagers without supervision of adults or guidance. It's these individuals that has the biggest problems really with all of the choices that our young people seem to make today. It's hypocrisy at its finest, because at some point we all were kids that did dumb things. We all broke rules, laws, and made mistakes on our pathway between being boys and being young men and women. So to act like our kids today are any different than we were, to act like they are not still deserving of the same freedoms and the same opportunities to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and grow, it shows our practiced apathy and the effect that it's had on us as a society. Now, across the city, multiple pools have been closed due to aging infrastructure and other things that could have been addressed over the off season, but one. So now the results are our kids not having access to these pools because they were never fixed during the time that we actually had to address the problems in the first place. The real fact is, Black kids don't get any of the privileges that affluent white kids grow up with unless our parents are extremely successful. Even then, our access to those privileges always comes with a caveat, as we're made to feel like we don't actually deserve to be there. The government also does little, if anything, to try to help our community in terms of making access to those type of resources equitable, even though we have the money and the resources to do it in our city budget and in our planning, but it never seems to be an appropriate priority for us to pursue. Right now, we're actually in the middle of one of the hottest summers on record. We're in the middle of July, and 2 city pools are closed for the season, and a third one has yet to open. That's 3 public pools that are closed amid blistering heat. And a lot of our families here in the city are asking valid questions about why city pools are closed for the season, how this actually is allowed to happen when our policymakers knew that this was an issue and knew that the time was coming when they were going to have to close these pools, and the access to the people living in these communities, you know what I mean, would not be there. And it wasn't a priority. People in the community are asking why that is. A lot of them know that there's finger pointing going on, from Reckin Parks to our policymakers to the people that are in positions where they were informed about what was happening and didn't do anything to change it. A lot of people are citing things as they pass the blame, like broken motors and other maintenance issues, as the key reasons why there had to be these closures. Now, of these closures, Patterson Park and Cherry Hill pools were closed due to maintenance issues that are so extensive that it's said that they'll be closed not just for the full summer, but into the winter. The Clifton pool also remains inoperable until further notice. Now, this issue of infrastructure isn't a new one. City leadership, as well as the leadership of Rec and Parks and other neighborhood organizations responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the pools, knew for a long time prior to this that the pools wouldn't be operational if these issues weren't addressed. But still, they chose not to address them because, again, they did not care. And still, the larger community wouldn't necessarily focus in on our policymakers, but they would rather demonize our youth than to put the spotlight on all of the political players that are actually responsible for the lack of funding, jobs, and accountability going on in this process. Our city leaders have always talked about issues like violence and crime in our city, but when we're talking about how to fix these issues of crime and violence, very rarely are we pointing out the fact that our pools, our libraries, our rec centers, and other forms of community investment are actually the best, most proven ways of preventing crime before they actually get committed. Now, Baltimore City Councilman Zeke Cohen has been very vocal about this issue for some time now, publicly. And he's let everybody know that the time was coming when some of these pools would have to close down if we didn't address the infrastructure. He said very clearly the other day, children in Baltimore experience a lot of challenges and a lot of trauma. They should at least be able to swim safely and experience the joy of a public pool. Now, of course, I agree with that statement. There's nothing to argue with there. But I also do feel the need to point out that Councilman Cohen, as much as he is a huge advocate of doing the right thing here, he's also approved a city budget for years that prioritizes investing in policing over community. And he's definitely heard from members of the community that that's not what we want. But again, when you choose to invest in age-old practices that do not work and have been proven never to work in terms of making our community safer, then this is what we get. What we need to see more of is the type of legislation and community action that leads to investing in these resources before they are deprived from our kids. But that's not usually what we get. Councilman Cohen has been pushing for repairs to the Patterson Park pool since 2019, when he and the state delegation were able to secure about $3.5 million for the pool's renovations. The repairs were supposed to be made last year, mind you. But Cohen said that Rec and Parks is claiming that they could not find a contractor to carry out the maintenance necessary to fix the problem. As many contractors as we have in this city, independent and otherwise, they couldn't find one person that would take the $3.5 million that was raised and fix the problems that we have. Okay. Makes no sense to me, but if that's what we're going with, okay. And there are also other issues besides the ones that have already been stated that need to be addressed in order to stop the spread of closures at pools across the city. Problems like flooding, broken pump motors, a lack of serviceable lifeguards. All of the issues with the lifeguards is really the primary one that I want to focus in on for a little bit as well. It's the one that people aren't paying enough attention to. We take our kids at the rec center here swimming about once a week, every week, and we've done that for the past few years. So far this summer, every single week that we've gone, we've had a different issue regarding staffing, lifeguards, new protocols and procedures, etc. These things have impacted the amount of time that our kids had to actually spend time in the water. But rather than just complaining about these issues to the staff, I've actually spent a lot of time since then actually talking to the lifeguards, the staff, and the different employees at Rec and Parks to find out where the gaps are and where the problems are. They've done a lot to educate me about how this situation got to be this way and kind of some of the things that we can do to actually address it in a substantial way. Now, for one, according to several employees that I've spoken with, Rec and Parks does a horrible job of treating their staff well. They do a horrible job of creating an environment that many of them want to work in. They also don't pay their people well enough, and their hiring process has a lot of flaws that need to be addressed in order to fix the lack of available lifeguards that we have during the summertime. Employees at Rec and Parks, they know that they could be making between $10,000 and $30,000 more simply by working in Baltimore County, Howard County, or Montgomery County. So because of that, we're losing a lot of our best employees to those counties and to better pay. Some of the counties are the main reason for the people leaving, and we're losing other employees to employers like Amazon, and the rest to anywhere else pretty much that's paying a living wage that these people actually have access to in terms of employment. And a lot of people are putting blame on our youth, not just the youth that are hopping fences to go swimming, but the youth that aren't themselves lifeguards. Why is it that more of our teenagers and young adults aren't taking these jobs as lifeguards as we've had in the past? One person on Twitter even had the audacity to tell me that our youth are too lazy to want to work jobs like being a lifeguard. And these people are the ones that I honestly laugh at, because there's no way that you could actually know our kids here in Baltimore and believe that. Our young black kids here are a bunch of hustlers and go-getters. Whether you're talking squeegeeing, you know what I mean, coming up with a little side business that they're selling through their school or through their neighborhood, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, these kids are industrious, they're hardworking, and they're willing to work. If you don't believe me, look at the fact that every single year, despite the amount of kids that are able to get hired through YouthWorks, you still have hundreds of kids that are looking for placement during the summer, during the winter, and pretty much any other time that they get out of school. But where are the places that we actually have to send them to? Where are the places that we have that are offering them the training necessary and the placements that they're going to need in order to do that job effectively? Here's the thing. Not only is this myth of our kids not wanting to work hard a fucking lie, but it's also an insult to the work ethic of our young people. You know, many of them would become lifeguards if they knew that it was both an available and a tangible option for them. If they were more informed on the process than they are. We have hundreds of kids every summer that are looking for work, but most of the time, if they don't get placed through YouthWorks, they spend the rest of their summer scrambling to find any type of job or organization that will have them. What I didn't know though was, and I didn't even realize it myself, so I know most of our kids don't know, is all of the flaws that are in Rec and Parks' hiring system when it comes to lifeguards and the aquatics. But I started finding these things out as I started talking to more and more employees. Because of Rec and Parks' hiring process, our kids can't simply show up a couple weeks before the summer starts and expect to be able to get placed at a pool in time to work for the summer. Most of Rec and Parks applicants that they hire actually start their process in March or April, way before most of our teenagers are actually out there actively looking for summer jobs. And by the time our teenagers are coming to the interviews, by the time our kids are coming to most of these interviews, by the time they need to be trained and looking for placement, these summer positions have already been filled. To this day, I've never seen any recruiting efforts really being made by Rec and Parks to address this disparity or to target the kids that they could be getting as potential employees, to hire more lifeguards during the summertime. But that's something that we actually need to see a tangible improvement in order for all of these pools to be staffed. And at the end of the day, the most frustrating part of the coverage behind and around this incident is the fact that kids being kids seems to only be a thing when the kids happen to be white. Black kids don't get the luxury of doing childish shit and still being able to be seen as human beings deserving of all of the resources and opportunity that everybody else gets. I could think of so many worse things that our kids could be out here doing on a hot summer day than hopping a fence and going swimming in a pool. But this is what we choose to focus on and criminalize. Yes, it's not ideal that there was no lifeguards present. But I could also list so many places that people go swimming every single day where there are no lifeguards there. Places like lakes, reservoirs, private beaches, rivers, the list goes on and on. I've never been arguing that our kids should be swimming in spaces where they're not protected. Of course, that is the ideal scenario. But what I am saying though, is the fact that we're more concerned about chastising them for going swimming than we are concerned about making sure that all of them have access to safe, fully staffed swimming pools is the biggest problem. And another thing that I really can't stand is the way that people politicize these incidents like it's the Democratic or the Republican Party by themselves that is responsible for this predicament. Let me say this one more time, as clearly and loudly as I can for the people in the back that are hard of hearing. I don't give a fuck about either of these political parties. They're both exactly the same to me. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an independent voter who only supports candidates that support my community. I vote in my interests, and I think that that's something that a lot more African Americans in this country should be doing, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of liberal versus conservative. We have to make these politicians earn our votes. Both political parties are equally to blame for the state of our communities. And as bad as the Democratic leadership of our city in Baltimore has been for decades, the Republican Party has been even worse. If it were up to Republicans, there probably wouldn't be a single pool still functional in any black community in Baltimore. So that's not the option that everybody that's tweeting it says it is. So no, voting Republican instead of Democrat is not going to save us. And to be perfectly honest, we need to be holding all these pimp-ass politicians accountable regardless of their party or partisanship affiliation. There are a whole lot of you that are participating in the public discourse around this conversation who just need to go ahead on and admit that you hate us, that you hate our kids, and that you don't think that they're deserving of the same amenities and privileges and resources that kids in other communities have. Just say that and keep it moving. Because if a bunch of white kids in the county hop a fence and go swimming, nobody has a problem with it. There's no public outrage or public surveillance directed their way. And it's just a fun, creative way to beat the heat with your friends. But when the black and brown kids start doing that shit, when they're living in the inner city and they do the exact same thing, scramble the helicopter, rain down the public condemnation, call the police. But if that's not an indication of how we live in two separate societies in America, I don't know what it is. These disparities always seem to be much deeper in cities like Baltimore or Chicago or Philadelphia and Detroit than they are in cities where the demographic is much more mayonnaise than mochaccino. But last summer, the city of Chicago opened fewer than half of its neighborhood pools because of a persistent lifeguard shortage, similar to the one that we're having here in Baltimore. This year, district officials say that they're on track to reopen all of the city's public pools, thanks to a successful push to hire more lifeguards. Now, they did so with incentives to attract new lifeguards, where they made a concerted effort to start recruiting more lifeguards to their neighborhood pools earlier by getting a head start on the hiring process in May. It dramatically impacted the numbers of people that filled out applications to be lifeguards. They went from about 850 applicants the year before to over 1,800 people that applied as of May of 2023. The district also expanded their trainings, waived certification fees, and adopted a $600 signing bonus and offered incentives like soccer tickets and gym memberships for their employees. They also increased their pay, which is something that we desperately need to do here in the city of Baltimore as well. Now, this is something that we can do here in Baltimore that would help us to address the severe lack of lifeguards that we have to staff all of the city pools currently. We can adopt the same mindset and practice that Chicago has and look at how it would transform the landscape of employees and infrastructure that we have. Now, there's a cost to our nation's refusal to prioritize our most marginalized communities when it comes to community investment. And I know I'm going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but hey, it is what it is. In order for us to actually be able to make all of these different community investments that we've talked about in the esoteric sense, we need to look at more real, tangible ways of divesting from policing and investing those funds back into community resources that actually prevent crime. okay? That actually prevent crime. At this point, even the people that don't agree with the defund the police movement have to be able to acknowledge that one of the reasons that we continuously have so many hearings about why so many of our city agencies are having staffing issues and funding issues and programming issues is because we're not investing enough money into the things that actually work, the things that actually prevent crime. We just invest in policing and act like them responding after crimes are committed actually makes us any safer than we were before. It's impossible to look at our city's fiscal budget where nearly $600 million of our finances are going to the police, while so many of our other city agencies remain underfunded for years upon years upon years. What's the impact of that lack of funding on our most marginalized communities? What's the impact of that in the discourse within those communities? If we look at the amount of money that our city has spent on policing versus the amount of money that we spent funding rec and parks as a whole over a 10-year period, you see the disparity clear as day. The police have made over $4 billion more than rec and parks during that 10-year period. That should disgust you when you think about the fact that police aren't preventing any of these crimes from happening. But rec centers, pools, libraries, and other community investments actually do prevent crime by providing our youth with alternatives to the streets, alternatives that allow them to be educated, loved on, supported, nurtured, and believed in. If we want to transform our city for the better, we need to find ways of destroying this mentality that if you grew up in a poor neighborhood, that you don't deserve nice things. That's a toxic belief system that does not serve us, our city, or any of the communities within it. So, do you believe that if a basketball rim gets ripped off of a hoop on a court, that nobody should fix it? Do you believe that if the pools or the parks or the infrastructure of our community is crumbling, that nobody but the people living there are supposed to care? It's very telling the things that we're comfortable as a society allowing, as long as the people that are impacted by it don't look like us. We have to kill that demon. We have to find a way to start empathizing, loving, and serving one another again. I'm trying my best to lead by example, but it takes much more to normalize this behavior in a time where all factors seem to be converging to convince all of us that we don't need one another for survival. A greater lie has never been told. We need each other, always have and always will. And we need to believe in each other more than we condemn one another. But that starts with us doing the self-work and asking ourselves the hard question of what needs to happen for us to truly have a free and equitable society where everybody has the same access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm doing the best I can, but the question is, what are you doing?